The survey vessel broke apart like paper in a storm. Metal screamed against metal as the hull tore open, and David Reed felt his stomach drop as the small ship tumbled through the atmosphere of Frostholm 7. His fingers worked the emergency controls, but nothing responded. The engines were dead. Life support flickered and died. All he could do was grip the chair and pray the landing would be soft enough to survive. It wasn't soft, but he survived. David crawled from the wreckage, his ribs screaming in protest. Blood ran down his face from a cut above his eye, freezing almost instantly in the brutal cold. His ship lay scattered across the ice like broken toys, smoke rising from the ruined engine core. He stumbled to the cargo bay and pulled out what he could salvage: a medical kit, emergency rations for 3 days, a thermal scanner, and a heating unit that flickered weakly in his hands. The planet stretched endlessly in every direction. Ice and snow, broken only by massive crystalline formations that caught the light of the distant sun. Beautiful and deadly, David checked his emergency beacon, but the display showed nothing but error codes. The crash had destroyed it completely. No one was coming. No one even knew where he was. 3 days of food, a failing heating unit, and temperatures that would kill him in hours if he lost shelter. David dragged himself to a nearby ice formation and set up a basic camp. His hands shook as he activated the heating unit, watching the weak orange glow with desperate hope. He ate half a ration bar, treated his wounds with numb fingers, and tried to think. The survey mission had been routine. Map the planet, check for resources, move on. Now he was stranded on a world no human had ever walked before. Night fell fast on Frostholm 7. The temperature dropped so quickly David could hear the ice cracking around him. He huddled close to the heating unit, wrapping himself in emergency blankets that felt paper-thin against the cold. His breath came in clouds of white vapor. His injured ribs made every breath hurt. Sleep seemed impossible. Then he heard it, a sound unlike anything David had ever heard before. It started low, like wind through a canyon, then rose into something that made his chest tighten. Voices. Dozens of voices, maybe more, all crying together in perfect harmony. The sound was so full of grief that David felt tears freeze on his cheeks before he even realized he was crying. Every instinct told him to stay hidden. Unknown planet, unknown creatures, injured and alone. But the sound pulled at something deep inside him. That wasn't just noise. That was mourning. That was loss. That was pain he recognized in his own bones. David stood on shaking legs and followed the sound. The ice canyon opened before him like a wound in the planet's surface. Massive walls of crystal rose on either side, catching starlight and throwing it back in shades of blue and silver. And there in the center of the canyon, David saw them. Dragons, 20 of them, maybe more. Each as large as his destroyed ship, with scales that looked like living crystal. They formed a circle around something. Their long necks bowed, their wings folded against their bodies. The sound came from them, from their throats, a chorus of grief that echoed off the ice walls and seemed to shake the very ground. David's legs nearly gave out. Dragons. Real dragons. Not the legends from Earth, but living creatures of impossible size and beauty. Their scales reflected the starlight, making them look like they were made of the ice itself. Some had horns that curved like frozen waves. Others had spines along their backs that glowed faintly in the darkness. He should have run. Should have hidden. Should have done anything except step closer. But David stepped closer. In the center of their circle lay a nest, and in that nest, David saw dozens of small forms lying perfectly still. Hatchlings. Baby dragons. Each no bigger than a large dog. Their scales dulled, and their bodies frozen in the positions they had died in. Some were curled together as if trying to share warmth. Others lay with their tiny wings spread, as if they had been trying to fly away from the cold that killed them. The adult dragons mourned around them, touching the dead hatchlings with their snouts, making sounds that tore at David's heart. One massive dragon, larger than the others with silver scales and scars across her face, stood at the head of the nest. Her golden eyes were fixed on the dead young, and her whole body shook with each breath. Then those golden eyes found David. He froze. The dragon's head turned slowly, her gaze locking onto the small human standing at the edge of the canyon. David raised his empty hands, though he knew it was useless. If she wanted to kill him, there was nothing he could do to stop her, but she didn't move toward him. She simply looked at him with those ancient eyes, and David saw something he never expected to see in a creature so alien. He saw grief. Raw, overwhelming grief that matched the sound still echoing from the other dragons' throats. She recognized him as another living thing. Not food, not threat. Just another creature in a cold universe. The dragon turned back to the nest. The other dragons had noticed David now, but none of them moved toward him. They simply returned to their mourning, their cries rising and falling in waves of sound that made the ice beneath David's feet vibrate. David's thermal scanner hung from his belt. His hands moved without conscious thought, pulling it free and activating it. He pointed it at the nest, at the still forms of the dead hatchlings. The screen showed what he expected, cold. Frozen solid. No life signs. Then he moved the scanner deeper into the nest. 3 readings. Faint, growing weaker by the moment, but there. 3 eggs buried beneath the bodies of their siblings, still pulsed with heat. Still lived. David looked at the scanner, then at the dragons, then back at his makeshift camp where his heating unit waited. 3 days of power left in that unit. 3 days of warmth that might keep him alive long enough for a miracle rescue that would never come. Or 3 eggs that might live if someone helped them. The silver dragon watched him with those knowing eyes. David made his choice. David took 3 steps toward the nest before the dragons moved. 2 younger ones, their scales the color of ice at dawn, stepped into his path. Their throats glowed orange from within, and David could feel heat radiating from their mouths. One wrong move and they would burn him to ash. He stopped and raised his hands higher. His thermal scanner dangled from one hand, its screen still showing those 3 precious life signs. David pointed at it, then at the nest, trying to make them understand. The scanner beeped softly, marking the fading heat signatures. The silver dragon made a sound. Not the mourning cry from before, but something else. A rumble that David felt in his chest. The 2 younger dragons stepped aside immediately, though their eyes never left him. David moved forward slowly. Each step felt like it took forever. The mourning dragons watched him, their massive heads turning to track his movement. He could see their eyes now, dozens of them, all different colors. Golden green and deep blue, all filled with the same desperate hope mixed with suspicion. He reached the edge of the nest and looked down. The dead hatchlings were small, so much smaller than their parents. Their scales lacked the crystalline shine of the adults. Some still had their eyes closed, as if they had died in their sleep. David's throat tightened. He had seen death before, but this felt different. These were children. Beneath them, partially hidden, he saw the 3 eggs. They were larger than he expected, each about the size of his torso. Their shells had a faint glow like embers in a dying fire, but that glow was getting weaker. He could see it fading even as he watched. David held up the thermal scanner, making sure the silver dragon could see it. He pointed at the eggs, then at the reading on the screen. Temperature dropping. Time remaining. Hours, not days. He didn't know if she could understand technology, but he hoped she could understand urgency. The silver dragon moved closer. David's heart hammered as she lowered her enormous head until her eye was level with his chest. She was so close he could feel the heat from her body, could smell something like hot stone and sulfur. Her eye, as large as his head, studied the scanner. Then she looked at him. She understood. He could see it in the way her pupil widened, the way her breathing changed. She understood that her children were dying, and this strange, small creature was trying to tell her. David pointed back the way he had come, toward his crashed ship. He made a gesture for fire, for heat, though he felt foolish doing it. How did you explain a heating unit to a dragon? He drew in the snow with his boot, trying to show the path, the ship, something that could help. The silver dragon pulled back and made another sound. This one was different again, sharper, more like a command. The other dragons shifted, creating a path through their circle. Then one of them stepped forward. She was smaller than the others, her scales the color of bronze with hints of green at the edges. Her eyes were bright and young, less scarred by time than the silver leader. She looked at David, then at the eggs, then back at David. When she lowered her body and extended one wing toward the ground, David understood. She was offering to carry him. David had never been this close to anything so large and alive. Her scales felt warm under his hands as he pulled himself onto her back, between her wing joints. The scales were smooth but had texture like polished stone with fine grooves. He found a place where he could grip, where the scales formed natural handholds. The bronze dragon turned her head to look at him. Her eye was green with flecks of gold. David nodded. though he didn't know if she understood the gesture. She must have understood something, because her muscles bunched beneath him and then they were moving. She ran first, building speed across the ice. David held on desperately as the wind tore at his face and clothes. Then her wings snapped open, each one as long as his ship had been, and they lifted into the air. Flying was nothing like David had imagined. The dragon's movements were smooth but powerful, each wing beat carrying them higher. The frozen landscape spread below them, beautiful and terrible in the starlight. David could see ice formations stretching to the horizon, could see the canyon with its circle of mourning dragons growing smaller behind them. The cold was worse in the air. Wind cut through David's clothes like knives. Ice formed on his eyebrows and in his hair. He pressed himself closer to the dragon's back, trying to steal some of her warmth. She adjusted her flight, angling her body to give him some shelter from the wind. They flew in silence except for the rush of air and the steady beat of wings. David's crashed ship appeared in the distance, a dark scar against the white ice. The dragon circled it once, her head turning to study the wreckage. Then she landed with surprising gentleness. David slid from her back on shaking legs. The cargo bay was still partially intact, its doors hanging open. He climbed inside and started pulling out everything that might help. The heating unit, barely functional but still working. Power cables, the backup battery from the medical pod, emergency thermal blankets that might insulate the eggs. The dragon watched from outside, too large to fit through the door. She made questioning sounds, soft rumbles that David was starting to recognize as communication. He worked faster, his fingers clumsy with cold and urgency. He found what he needed and started building. The heating unit connected to the battery. The thermal blankets wrapped around the assembly to hold the heat, wire and cable to make it portable. It wasn't elegant, but it might work. It had to work. The bronze dragon helped. When David needed something held steady, she used her claws with surprising delicacy. When he needed light to see, she breathed small flames that illuminated his work without burning anything. They worked together in the ruins of his ship, human and dragon, trying to save lives neither of them had known existed an hour ago. When the heating unit was ready, humming with power and glowing orange-red, David strapped it to the dragon's back. She stood patiently as he secured it, tested it, made sure it would survive the flight. Then she looked at him with those green-gold eyes and lowered her body again. David climbed on, holding the heating unit steady. The dragon's muscles tensed, her wings opened, and they launched back into the frozen sky. As they flew back toward the canyon, back toward the dying eggs in the morning pack, David felt something wet on the scales beneath his hands. He looked down and saw moisture on the dragon's neck crystallizing in the cold air. She was crying. Dragons could cry. The tears froze as they fell, tiny crystals of grief carried away by the wind. David held on tighter and cried with her. They returned to find chaos. The dragons had moved closer to the nest, forming a tighter circle. Several of them were breathing fire directly at the eggs, trying to warm them. But dragon fire wasn't made for warming. It was made for fighting and hunting. The flames were too hot, too fierce. David could see scorch marks on the shells of the eggs, black spots spreading across the faint glow. The bronze dragon landed hard, and David jumped from her back before she fully stopped. He ran toward the nest, shouting without words, just noise to make them stop. The dragons turned toward him, startled. Some pulled their fire back. Others kept breathing flames, desperate and not understanding. David ran right into the circle. He could feel the heat singing his clothes and hair. His hands went up, waving, trying to get between the dragons and the eggs. One massive blue-scaled dragon swung his head toward David, fire building in his throat. For a moment, David thought he had made a fatal mistake. The silver leader roared. The sound was so loud that ice cracked and fell from the canyon walls. Every dragon froze, fire dying in their throats. She moved between David and the others, her body a living shield. Then she looked at him and stepped aside, giving him access to the nest. David dropped to his knees beside the eggs. 2 of them had stopped glowing entirely. The third flickered so faintly he could barely see it. His hands shook as he checked the thermal scanner. The readings were bad. Worse than bad. Minutes, not hours. The dragon's desperate attempt to help had pushed the eggs to the edge. The heating unit was still strapped to the bronze dragon's back. David ran back to her, unhooked it with fumbling fingers, and carried it to the nest. It was heavy, almost too heavy, but adrenaline made him strong. He set it down in the center, right between the 3 eggs, and activated it. Nothing happened. David's blood turned to ice. He checked the connections, tapped the battery, adjusted the power flow. Still nothing. The impact from landing must have knocked something loose. He tore open the access panel, his fingers slipping on the cold metal. Inside, he could see the problem. A wire had come free, just one single wire, but it was enough to kill the whole system. The dragons pressed closer, watching. David could feel their eyes on him, feel their hope turning to despair. His fingers were nearly numb from the cold, making the work almost impossible. He grabbed the wire, tried to reconnect it, but his hands were shaking too badly. Warmth touched his shoulder. David looked up to see the bronze dragon lowering her head beside him. She breathed out slowly, carefully, a thin stream of warm air that flowed over his hands. Not fire, just breath, just warmth. His fingers stopped shaking. David reconnected the wire. The heating unit hummed to life, its glow spreading through the nest. He turned the power to maximum, knowing it would drain the battery faster but not caring. The eggs needed heat now, not later. The dragons went silent. The only sound was the hum of the heating unit and the whistle of wind across the canyon. David placed his hands on the closest egg, the one that had stopped glowing. The shell was cold under his palms, too cold. He looked at the thermal scanner and felt his heart sink. No reading. No heat signature. They were too late, but he left the heating unit running. For the third egg, the one still flickering. For whatever chance remained, minutes passed. David knelt in the snow, his hands on the cold egg, and waited. The dragons waited with him. Some sat on their haunches. Others lay down, their huge bodies settling onto the ice. The silver leader stood at the head of the nest, her eyes fixed on the eggs her pack had failed to save. David's own eyes were closing. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind exhaustion and pain from his injuries. The cold was seeping into his bones despite the heating unit's glow. He had given everything he could. It wasn't enough. Nothing was enough against a planet this cold, against fate this cruel. Then something moved under his hand. David's eyes snapped open. The egg beneath his palm was warming, not just from the heating unit, from inside. He pulled his hand back and saw the shell starting to glow again, faint but growing stronger. The second egg began to pulse with light too, its shell brightening from dark to dim to visible. The dragons saw it. One by one they raised their heads. The mourning cries that had filled the canyon since David arrived changed into something else. Not quite hope, but not despair either. Something between, something like prayer. An hour passed. The eggs grew warmer. Their glow became steady. David checked the thermal scanner obsessively, watching the temperature readings climb. Still low, still dangerous, but climbing. The heating unit was working. Life was coming back. The bronze dragon moved beside David and lay down, curling her body around him and the heating unit. Her warmth was immediate and overwhelming. Other dragons did the same, forming a living wall around the nest. They weren't just protecting the eggs anymore. They were protecting him too. David leaned against the bronze dragon's side, feeling her breathing, feeling her heartbeat through the scales. He was so tired. His injuries hurt. His hands were raw from the cold and work. But the eggs were glowing brighter now, pulsing with life that had been almost lost. The silver leader approached and lowered her massive head until her snout nearly touched David's face. Her breath was hot and smelled of sulfur and something else, something like cinnamon. She exhaled slowly and David felt the warmth flow over him. Then she did something he didn't expect. She touched her snout gently to his forehead, just for a moment, scales against skin. David didn't know what it meant in dragon terms, but he knew what it meant to him. Gratitude, recognition, the acknowledgement that he had tried, that he had helped, that he mattered. The third egg cracked. The sound was small, but in the silent canyon it echoed like thunder. Every dragon's head turned. David scrambled forward, his exhaustion forgotten. A line appeared in the shell, then another. The egg rocked back and forth. A tiny claw pushed through, silvery and new. The hatchling that emerged was small enough to fit in David's arms. Its scales were silver like the pack leader, its eyes huge and unfocused. It was wet and weak and made small sounds that were almost like crying, but it was alive. The silver leader moved forward and touched her snout to the hatchling with infinite gentleness. The small dragon nuzzled against her, seeking warmth. She made a sound David had never heard from her before, something soft and tender and full of love. The second egg cracked an hour later. This hatchling was bronze, like the dragon who had carried David. It tumbled out of its shell with more energy than the first, tiny wings flapping uselessly. The bronze dragon touched it with her snout, and the hatchling grabbed onto her scales, climbing clumsily up her leg. The third egg stayed quiet. David kept the heating unit running, kept hoping. But as dawn began to break over Frostholm 7, painting the ice in shades of purple and pink, the egg remained still and dark. 2 out of 3. 2 lives saved. 1 lost. David felt tears on his face again. The dragons gathered around the third egg, touching it gently with their snouts, saying goodbye to a child who would never know the sky. Their morning song rose again, but softer now, sad but not broken, grief mixed with relief that some had survived. The silver leader picked up the first hatchling in her mouth, gentle as a thought, and placed it in David's lap. The small dragon curled against his chest, seeking his warmth. The bronze dragon did the same with her hatchling. They placed their children with him, trusting him with their most precious things. David sat in the snow with 2 baby dragons in his arms, surrounded by creatures who should have been his death but were treating him like family. The heating unit hummed between them. The sun rose higher, and David realized that he had no idea what came next, but for the first time since his ship crashed, he wasn't afraid. Days turned into weeks. David lost count of how many. Time moved differently on Frostholm 7, measured not in hours but in survival. The dragons had moved deeper into the ice canyon, finding caves that offered shelter from the worst of the wind. They brought David with them, carrying him when he was too tired to walk, sharing their warmth when the heating unit's battery finally died. The 2 hatchlings grew quickly. The silver one, which David started calling Small Silver in his mind, learned to walk within days. Its legs were wobbly at first, but it followed the larger dragons everywhere, trying to mimic their movements. The bronze hatchling was bolder, climbing on anything it could reach, including David. Both of them treated him like one of the pack, nuzzling against him for warmth and making small chirping sounds when he moved away. The dragons taught David how to survive. The bronze dragon, his first ally, showed him which ice formations held pockets of warmer air. She led him to underground vents that breathed heat from deep in the planet's core. When David's emergency rations ran out, the pack shared their kills. Strange creatures that lived beneath the ice, pale and eyeless, but with meat that David learned to cook over carefully controlled dragon fire. David learned their language, or at least parts of it. Dragons didn't speak in words like humans did. They communicated through sounds that ranged from deep rumbles to high whistles, combined with body movements and the way they held their wings. The bronze dragon was patient with him, repeating sounds until he could match them. When he got something right, she would touch her snout to his hand. The silver leader watched everything. She was old, David realized, older than the others by decades at least. Her scales had chips and cracks that told stories of battles and survival. She led the pack with a quiet authority that needed no words. When food was scarce, she ate last. When danger threatened, she positioned herself between the pack and the threat, and she watched David with eyes that seemed to measure his every action. One morning, David woke to find the pack preparing to move. They made sounds he was starting to understand meant travel, journey, migration. The canyon's thermal vents were cooling. He could feel it himself, the air getting colder each day. The pack needed to find new warmth, especially with the hatchlings still so young. David helped pack what little he had salvaged from his ship: tools, medical supplies, pieces of technology that might be useful. The dragons watched with interest as he worked, sometimes picking up items with their claws and examining them. Small Silver tried to eat a power coupling until David gently pulled it away. The journey across the ice was brutal. David rode on the bronze dragon's back while the pack flew in formation around them. The hatchlings were carried by older dragons cradled in their claws with careful gentleness. Wind screamed across the frozen plains. Snow fell so thick that David could barely see the dragon in front of him. His face went numb despite the scarf he had made from thermal blankets. His fingers ached even pressed against the bronze dragon's warm scales. They flew for hours. David's muscles cramped from holding on. His injured ribs, mostly healed, started to hurt again. Just when he thought he couldn't hold on anymore, the bronze dragon began to descend. Below them, David saw something that made his heart lift. Steam rising from cracks in the ice. A whole field of thermal vents, larger than any they had found before. The pack landed near the largest vent. Heat rose from the ground in waves, melting the snow into pools of water. It was the warmest David had felt since arriving on Frostholm 7. The dragons settled around the vents, some lying directly over them, others forming protective circles around the hatchlings. David slid from the bronze dragon's back and immediately collapsed. His legs wouldn't hold him. The flight had taken everything he had. He lay in the snow, breathing hard, feeling like he might never move again. Small Silver wobbled over and climbed onto his chest, its tiny body warm and surprisingly heavy. The hatchling curled up and went to sleep immediately. The bronze dragon made a sound that David had learned meant concern. He raised one hand to show he was okay, just tired. She lowered her head and breathed warm air over him until he stopped shivering. Then she lay down beside him, creating a windbreak with her body. That night, as the pack settled into their new home, David watched the stars. They were different from Earth's stars, different constellations telling different stories. He thought about his old life, the research missions that took him from planet to planet, the loneliness he had never quite admitted, the way he had always been moving, never staying, never connecting. He had told himself it was adventure, freedom. But maybe it was just running. Here, stranded and broken on the most inhospitable planet he had ever seen, David felt more at home than he had in years. The dragons didn't care that he was strange-looking, that he couldn't fly, that he needed technology to survive where they thrived naturally. They just cared that he had tried to save their children, that he stayed, that he helped. The Silver Leader approached in the darkness. David sat up, careful not to wake Small Silver. The pack leader studied him for a long moment. Then she did something she had never done before. She extended her claw and deliberately, carefully touched his forearm. Not hard enough to hurt, but hard enough to leave a mark. A thin line of blood welled up, bright red against his pale skin. David didn't flinch. He understood what was happening, even if he didn't understand the specifics. This was a ritual, a marking. The bronze dragon had told him stories through gesture and sound, stories of how the pack marked their own. Claws on scales leaving permanent patterns that told who you belonged to. But David didn't have scales. Just skin. The mark would scar, permanent and visible, a sign that he belonged to this pack. That he was one of them now, not just a guest or an outsider. The Silver Leader pulled back and made a sound. The other dragons responded, their voices rising in harmony. Not mourning this time. Something else. Acceptance. Welcome. The word that came to David's mind was home, though he didn't know if dragons had a word for that concept. The bronze dragon touched her snout to his hand. Small Silver woke up and chirped sleepily. The other hatchling climbed over and tried to fit in David's lap with its sibling. All around him, dragons settled in for the night, their breathing creating a rhythm like waves on a shore. David looked at the mark on his arm, red and stark. Tomorrow it would hurt. The day after it would scar. And every day after that, he would carry proof that he belonged to this pack, these dragons, this frozen planet that should have killed him but gave him family instead. He fell asleep surrounded by dragons, warmer than he had been in weeks, and dreamed of flying. 3 months after the crash, David had learned to read the sky. The way ice crystals formed in the air meant a storm was coming. The color of the aurora told him which direction the warmest winds would blow. The sound of ice cracking in the distance warned when the ground was unstable. He had become part of the planet's rhythm, learning to survive not despite Frostholm 7, but with it. The hatchlings were the size of horses now. Small Silver had grown into its name with scales that caught light like mirrors. The bronze hatchling, which the pack called something that sounded like wind through crystals, could almost fly. Its wings were still too small to carry it far, but it glided from high places with increasing confidence. Both hatchlings followed David everywhere, treating him like a strange, scaleless parent. The pack had accepted David's oddities. They understood he needed fire to cook his food. They tolerated his need to sleep more than they did. They helped him build a shelter from ice and salvaged ship metal, using their fire to melt and reshape the ice into walls. In return, David helped them in ways they couldn't help themselves. His hands could reach into small spaces to pull out prey. His mind could solve problems that didn't require strength or fire. But survival on Frostholm 7 was never certain. David noticed the pack growing restless. The thermal vents at their current location were cooling again. Food was becoming scarce. The ice creatures they hunted were migrating away, following heat sources the pack couldn't detect. The Silver Leader spent long periods standing on high ridges, looking across the frozen landscape with troubled eyes. David built tools from his salvaged ship parts, a compass that pointed toward thermal anomalies, maps drawn on sheets of metal, marking safe routes and dangerous areas. He showed these to the Bronze Dragon, trying to explain his idea. They could scout ahead, find the best migration path before the whole pack moved, find areas rich with prey and strong thermal vents. The Bronze Dragon understood. She brought his idea to the Silver Leader through sounds and movements David couldn't fully follow. The pack debated, their rumbles filling the ice caves. Some were skeptical of trusting the strange humans' methods. Others, especially the younger dragons who had watched David's tools work before, were curious. The Silver Leader listened to all of them, then made her decision with a single authoritative sound. They would try David's way. David and the Bronze Dragon scouted for 3 days. They flew in expanding circles, David using his thermal scanner and compass while she used senses he didn't have. Together they found a massive vent system 30 miles north, larger than anything the pack currently used. The area was rich with ice creature burrows, protected by high cliffs that would break the worst winds. Perfect. They returned to guide the pack. The migration went smoothly at first. David had marked the safe route, avoiding areas where the ice was too thin or where crevasses hid under snow. The pack flew in formation, the oldest and strongest dragons carrying the hatchlings and David's few possessions. They made good time reaching the halfway point by the afternoon. Then the storm hit. Not the normal Frostholm 7 storms David had learned to predict, something worse. The sky turned black in minutes. Wind came from every direction at once, so strong it knocked dragons off course. Snow fell so thick it created complete whiteout conditions. Temperature dropped so fast that ice formed on dragon scales, weighing them down. The pack landed immediately, bunching together for shelter. Dragons wrapped their wings around each other, creating barriers against the wind. The Silver Leader positioned the pack in the lee of an ice ridge, using the terrain to break the wind's force. They were safe. Uncomfortable, but safe. Then David realized the hatchlings were missing. Small Silver and the bronze hatchling, curious and young and foolish, had wandered away from the pack before the storm hit. The Bronze Dragon noticed at the same moment. She made a sound that was pure panic. The other dragons heard and added their voices. The Silver Leader moved to search, but the storm was too violent. Even adult dragons risked freezing if they flew in these conditions. David stood. His mind raced. The hatchlings were small. They could fit into spaces adult dragons couldn't. They would seek shelter, probably in the ice formations they liked to explore. But they were also young and scared, and wouldn't know how to survive this cold without the pack's protection. They had minutes, not hours. The Bronze Dragon tried to follow as David gathered his equipment. He stopped her with a gesture. She was too large to fit where he needed to go. Her body heat would drain faster in the storm, but David was small. His heating unit was dead, but he had thermal blankets. His body produced less heat but also lost it slower. He could move through tight spaces and crevasses. He had a chance. The Silver Leader stepped in front of him. Her eyes said everything. This was suicide. The storm would kill him. Even if he found the hatchlings, he couldn't carry them back. Even if he made it to shelter, he had no way to warm them. But David met her eyes and didn't back down. Those hatchlings had trusted him, had climbed into his lap and fallen asleep against his chest, had chirped with joy when he returned from scouting trips. He was their pack. Pack didn't abandon each other. The Silver Leader stepped aside. She understood. In dragon culture or human culture, some things were the same. Family protected family, even when it was impossible. David wrapped himself in thermal blankets, took his ice axe and scanner, tied a length of cable to his waist so he wouldn't lose his way back. The Bronze Dragon touched her snout to his face one last time, her breath warm against his skin. Then David stepped into the storm. The world became white noise. Wind tried to tear him off his feet. Snow blinded him immediately. Temperature dropped so low that each breath hurt his lungs. David pushed forward, using his scanner to search for heat signatures. The device barely worked in these conditions, its screen flickering and dying and coming back. He found them in an ice crevasse, huddled together but shaking violently. Small Silver's eyes were closed. The bronze hatchling was trying to breathe fire but only producing weak sparks. They were both covered in ice, their scales losing their color as hypothermia took hold. David dropped to his knees beside them. He wrapped them both in thermal blankets, covered their bodies with his own, and activated his heating unit's last emergency reserves. The device glowed red, pouring out its final stores of warmth. It would last maybe an hour. Then nothing. The hatchlings pressed against him. David felt their hearts beating, too slow, too weak. He talked to them in words they couldn't understand, in sounds he had learned from their pack, in the universal language of presence that said, "You are not alone." The storm screamed around them. The heating unit began to dim, and David held on, pouring every bit of warmth from his own body into the young dragons shaking in his arms. He had saved them once before, on the night he crashed. He would save them again now, even if it cost him everything. David didn't remember the pack finding them. He remembered cold, then warmth, then darkness. When consciousness returned, he was buried under dragon bodies. Heat surrounded him from every direction. His fingers and toes burned as blood flow returned. His lungs ached from breathing frozen air. But he was alive. Small silver and the bronze hatchling were pressed against his chest, breathing steadily. Their scales had returned to their normal shine. They were sleeping deeply, exhausted but safe. Around them, the adult dragons formed layers of protection. The bronze dragon closest, then others, then the silver leader standing guard at the entrance to wherever they were. David tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. His entire body was one massive bruise. Frostbite had taken the tips of 2 fingers on his left hand. His lips were cracked and bleeding. But he had all his limbs, all his important parts. He would heal. The storm had passed. Through the gap in the dragon's protective circle, David could see clear sky. The pack had found shelter in an ice cave, probably while searching for him and the hatchlings. The thermal vents David had marked were close. He could smell the sulfur on the air. The silver leader turned when David moved. She studied him for a long moment, then made a sound. The other dragons shifted, creating space. She approached and lowered her head until her scarred snout touched his chest, right where the hatchlings were sleeping. She held that position for several heartbeats. Then she looked at David with eyes that held something he couldn't quite name. Respect, gratitude, recognition. She raised one claw and touched the mark she had given him weeks ago. The scar had healed pale against his darker skin. She touched it gently, then made a sound that the whole pack echoed. David didn't need translation. He understood. He was pack. Fully. Completely. No questions remaining. The hatchlings woke and immediately tried to climb onto David despite his injuries. They chirped and made sounds that meant safe, warm home. David laughed even though it hurt and let them crawl over him. The bronze dragon made a sound that he had learned meant happiness mixed with relief. She touched her snout to his face, her breath washing over him. 6 months passed. David healed. The hatchlings grew larger. The pack thrived at the new thermal vents, hunting and resting in cycles that David now understood instinctively. His human possessions dwindled. His clothes were replaced with layers of dragon-scale sheds that held heat better than any fabric. His tools were adapted from ice and stone instead of metal and plastic. He was becoming something new. Not quite dragon, not quite human anymore. Something between. Then one clear morning, David heard a sound that stopped his heart. Ship engines. High in the atmosphere, distant but unmistakable. A human vessel running survey patterns across Frostholm 7's surface. The pack heard it too. They reacted with alarm, gathering close, preparing to flee to deeper caves. They had never seen a human ship before, but they recognized predator sounds. The silver leader made sounds that meant danger, run, hide. David stood frozen. His people, his species, they were here, probably running the same survey mission he had been on 6 months ago. If he signaled them, they would land. They would rescue him, take him back to warmth and safety and civilization. Medical care for his frostbitten fingers, food that wasn't half-frozen prey, a bed that wasn't ice and dragon scales. The bronze dragon came to his side. She made a questioning sound. Her eyes held understanding. She knew what the ship meant. She was giving him a choice. No one would stop him if he wanted to signal. The pack would understand. They would let him go back to his own kind. David looked at the pack, the silver leader watching with ancient eyes. The younger dragons who had taught him to hunt. Small silver and the bronze hatchling, now nearly adult-sized, who still slept pressed against him at night. The bronze dragon who had carried him through storms and across frozen wastes, who had learned to communicate with sounds and gestures, who had become something he had never had before. A true friend. He looked at his hands. The scar on his forearm. His clothes made from shed scales. His tools adapted from this world instead of brought from another. He thought about his old life. The loneliness he had never admitted. The way he had drifted from place to place, never connecting, never belonging. And he thought about the life he had now. Waking up warm in a pile of dragons. Teaching hatchlings to solve problems. Flying across frozen landscapes with the bronze dragon. Being part of something larger than himself. Being needed. Being home. The ship's engines grew louder. It would pass directly overhead in minutes. David could see it now, a dark shape against the blue-white sky. He had a signal flare in his emergency kit, salvaged from the crash. One flare and they would see him. One flare and everything would change. David pulled out the flare. The bronze dragon made a soft sound but didn't move away. The pack watched, waiting. David held the flare in his hand, feeling its weight. His ticket back to human civilization, his escape from this frozen death world. He put the flare back in his kit, closed the container, sealed it. Done. The ship continued its survey pattern, unaware of the human standing on the ice below. Within an hour it was gone. The engines faded to nothing. The sky was empty again except for ice crystals and aurora. The bronze dragon touched her snout to David's shoulder. She made a sound that he had learned meant question. Why stay? David looked at her, at the pack gathering around them, at the hatchlings bouncing with relief that the scary sound was gone. He tried to explain in the limited dragon language he had learned. Family, home, belonging. But the words weren't enough. So he did what dragons did. He touched his hand to her scales, leaned his weight against her side, and simply stayed. The silver leader made a sound. Not quite approval. Not quite surprise. Something that acknowledged choice and consequence. The pack relaxed. The moment passed. They returned to their routines as if nothing had happened, because for them nothing had changed. David was pack before the ship came. He was pack after it left. The choice he made didn't surprise them. It was what any pack member would do. Stay with family. A year after his crash, David sat on an ice ridge watching the stars. The bronze dragon lay beside him, her warmth a constant comfort. Small Silver and the bronze hatchling, now fully grown, were teaching younger hatchlings from a new clutch how to hunt. The silver leader oversaw everything with patient authority. The pack moved through their evening like a well-practiced dance, everyone knowing their role. David's hands were calloused and scarred. His hair had grown long, braided with dragon scales that held heat. His skin was weathered from constant cold and wind. He barely remembered what coffee tasted like. Couldn't recall his old apartment's address. The human world felt like a dream from someone else's life. The bronze dragon made a rumbling sound. Question. Happy? David looked at his strange life. At the impossible family he had found in the last place he ever expected. At the frozen planet that should have killed him but instead gave him something he had never had. A place where he belonged. Where he was needed. Where he was home. He made a sound back. The dragon word for yes, for contentment. For being exactly where you were meant to be. The bronze dragon made a sound that was almost like laughter. She pressed her snout to his hand, warm and solid and real. Below them, the pack settled in for the night. Dragons and one human, different but together. A family that worked. David leaned against his friend and watched the stars wheel overhead. Somewhere out there, human civilization continued without him. Ships explored. People lived their lives. The galaxy turned, and none of it mattered because here, on this frozen planet at the edge of known space, David Reed had found what he never knew he was searching for. He was home, finally completely home.